Hey guys, what's up? Flex here to talk about Call of Duty, more specifically skill-based matchmaking and Activision's recent public statements and articles posted on the topic. And we have some good news as well as some bad news, as well as Activision being called out for being disingenuous and gaslighting their community. These claims and feelings being expressed by even ex-Call of Duty devs, no less. It's pretty wild. This will be one of my more in-depth videos, so buckle up. We will be covering every angle that's been brought to the table on the issue recently to stay up to date on what's being discussed, among other developments as well. First things first, if you would please like this video as well as comment down below, and if you understand that I don't post that frequently or consistently, but you still want to show support by subscribing to my channel, I want to say thank you and I very much appreciate viewers like you. Now let's get into it. First, let's do a quick breakdown on what actually counts as skill-based matchmaking so there's no confusion, and skill-based matchmaking's history in Call of Duty and why it's super relevant to what Activision just did. Old matchmaking, first, did something very simple. Every player was collected based solely on ping, which resulted in a very random lobby of players, which is then separated into more or less equally skilled teams as a whole based on skill identifiers of each player. This was known as team balancing. There was a very early rudimentary form of team balancing which was very loose and not very strict at all, which relied mostly or heavily on people's rank and time played, which was applied as early as Call of Duty 4. That matchmaking fans seem to enjoy. The practice of only using team balancing continues over the next several Call of Duties before we get to Black Ops 2. Now we have a different form of skill-based matchmaking being applied to the process of finding players itself. In Black Ops 2, it was a very light form of skill-based matchmaking that only targeted, separated, and therefore protected players who were either brand spanking new or handicapped. After that loose, but some would say arguably necessary form of skill-based matchmaking was applied, the teams were then of course balanced via the system that again was fairly rudimentary in team balancing. Call of Duty players enjoyed this form of matchmaking as well. As time went on, we then see the development of engagement-optimized matchmaking, which includes and utilizes both forms of skill-based matchmaking previously mentioned, but other mechanics are also applied. Mechanics that, for example, purposely pair low-skilled players who don't buy cosmetics with high-skilled players who do buy cosmetics in order to try and persuade the lesser-skilled player to go and buy said cosmetics. Essentially making your lobbies easier by giving you lesser skilled prey if you spend additional money on cosmetics, and making your lobbies harder if you're the type of person that doesn't buy additional cosmetics. Several YouTubers have repeated said experiment, lobbying up with their friends without buying any microtransactions, playing several games to gather data, showing that generally they're going up against teams where almost every single person on the other team is wearing recent cosmetics / microtransactions, and then on the flip side they go to accounts where they all purchase said microtransactions and then once again lobby up, and now they're being paired mostly with people who are not buying cosmetics or wearing microtransactions, and the lobbies are noticeably easier. These types of tests expose the most extreme manifestation that we've seen so far of this patent in use. And this all began in 2019 when the reboot of Modern Warfare applied a very intense and very strict version of all three forms of matchmaking previously mentioned, with the most invasive, manipulative, and strict form of matchmaking the Call of Duty community had ever seen. And the algorithm was so strict and accurate that players many of the time would complete a match where almost every single person ended up with the same exact score, coining the phrase clone lobbies. Because the skill-based matchmaking was so strict and invasive and precise, it matched players by precisely matching their traits, skill levels, response times, accuracies, etc., setting players up with what, for all intents and purposes, equates to clones of themselves. The matches were described by some as feeling like a soccer match, where everyone is running and kicking for hours on end, and the ball is staying in the exact same spot. Fans absolutely did not enjoy this form of matchmaking. Many matches were ended in draws or ended by 1 point only. This also resulted in ridiculously high ping, since skill and/or engagement and manipulation of your experience was being prioritized over your connection, putting higher skilled players in increasingly smaller match pools, creating a super frustrating experience, which also didn't make players very happy at all either. Then when the initial season kicked off for the game and players began being blatantly punished for not buying the new microtransactions and the people were essentially being rewarded with easy prey every time they did buy microtransactions, this collectively pissed fans off even more, causing the discussion on skill-based matchmaking to absolutely explode. And online defenders of Activision trying to gaslight the fans into believing this wasn't happening did not make anything better. These manipulations were so disruptive in the Call of Duty community that some of the developers even received death threats, which is even more awful when you consider the fact that many of the devs receiving these threats had no control or say over matchmaking whatsoever. What was additionally unfortunate was Activision telling the devs that they needed to communicate to the fans that they would be receptive to feedback and totally transparent. And then on the flip side, after they told the fans this, Activision then told the devs that they would not at all discuss things like skill-based matchmaking or engagement-optimized matchmaking. The denial and gaslighting of the community that followed went on for years until Activision was bought by Microsoft, and soon after, Activision publicly started their conversation on matchmaking. But by this point, you now have so many people that are fed up with feeling manipulated that many have now turned to the extreme of wanting to get rid of all forms of skill-based matchmaking or balancing altogether. Other people, such as myself, suggest that we go back to the matchmaking of Black Ops 2, for instance, implementing simple protections for people brand new or handicapped, and after that, prioritizing ping while applying a loose or rudimentary team balancing thereafter. And it turns out a lot of ex-Call of Duty devs agree with that as well. But rather than Activision addressing the conversation towards the logical majority of fans asking for logical matchmaking, which is to prioritize ping and then have loose, rudimentary team balancing thereafter, it appears Activision is going to only address those in the extremes of the conversation that want to get rid of skill-based matchmaking/balancing altogether. Which some are saying is Activision setting up a straw man to collectively represent everybody else as well, and therefore being disingenuous with the conversation in another attempt to gaslight the community, while also trying to insinuate the team balancing in COD 4 is somehow equivalent in any way, shape, or form to the complex engagement-optimized matchmaking of today, which, to compare either of the two for the sake of an argument, is completely asinine. Activision knows that, and they also know that most fans just want matchmaking to go back to how it was in the gold/silver age of Call of Duty, which was prioritizing ping with very light balancing after the fact or something to that effect. But Activision instead, showing the detriments of having absolutely no skill-based matchmaking or balancing whatsoever, including the removal of team balancing, and then making the minute fall-off of player retention seem a lot larger than it actually is as a way to tell the fans that we obviously just can't make changes to revert back to the old days. I gotta say, it does very much come off as disingenuous and or gaslighting. But I still appreciate Activision actually speaking on this topic nonetheless, even if it is a slow start, because more and more people are becoming aware to the argument, as well as the flaws and holes in the argument against reverting back to classic matchmaking. Other individuals that feel like this as gaslighting includes Ghost of Hope, J God, and even Infinity Ward devs Robert Bowling, Mark Rubin, and Alex Hennessy. Let's start with Robert Bowling, who said this about the way Activision carefully worded their comparison of Call of Duty 4 to the modern form of matchmaking today. Quote, has considered skill as a factor and SBMM are drastically different things. The major changes since COD 4 has been the other reasons and ways that skill is weighted and used, particularly the introduction of Activision's patented process for matchmaking unskilled players with high-skilled players who own cosmetics the low-skilled player doesn't own but is likely to buy. So when people say skill-based matchmaking sucks, they're referring to the totality of the system, not the simple fact that any skill is considered. Alex Hennessy continues by reposting this and saying, always been in the mindset that when ping became less priority, matchmaking went downhill. Ping should be the highest consideration. Leave all the other bullshit to small percentages. Break skill up when you are in the pre-game lobby, like it used to be. For anyone who remembers or played the golden age of Call of Duty 2007 to 2012, when lobbies were created, in the top right corner or somewhere on the screen, it would say trying to balance teams or something of that sort. Most of the time, breaking up the tryhards. Even if the teams were balanced, you didn't notice how hard the games were because of connection. COD, for example. If there was only 2 10th prestige level 55s in the game, they were almost never on the same team. Matchmaking used to be perfect, just my opinion. These are Call of Duty devs that worked at Call of Duty during the peak of its fandom, where millions of people were so obsessed and drawn to the game without them having to be enticed by $200 million marketing every year. These guys are literally the experts, saying the things that many of us have been saying for years, while Activision and Activision defenders have tried to gaslight the community that we must all be wrong. But back to the devs, they are exactly right. When people are complaining about the current system of skill-based matchmaking, they are really complaining about the all-encompassing facets and mechanisms included under the umbrella of engagement-optimized matchmaking. And those external invasive facets are what actually causes the problems, if any, and we should instead just go back to how matchmaking used to be. It's not complicated. And the thing is, Activision already knows this, and their response is essentially burying the lead and reshaping the argument into an oversimplified straw man, and even still people can poke holes in their oversimplified argument. Now, it could be that this is their first of many responses regarding fans, and first they're just going to go after the more extremes who are saying absolutely no balancing whatsoever. But maybe later, after this, they will address the other groups of fans who have different opinions. And if that's the case, that would actually be pretty sweet, but it doesn't really appear that that's their intentions. Other people have pointed out how you can't compare older forms of balancing with modern forms of skill-based matchmaking because one key difference is that back in the day, you could stay in your lobby in Call of Duty and build bonds, rivalries, die-hard friendships with the players you met along the way. But today's engagement-optimized matchmaking is so controlling and invasive, it has to disband the lobbies every single time. Robert Bowling also talks on this as well, saying, quote, anyone between the ages of 13 to 25 who made a new friend in the years 2007 to 2009 made them because they were stuck in a lobby with them. More so, they started off hating them, then tolerated them, then became like a sibling to them. And this is so true, and it was so common back in the day, and it seems to have become more and more rare because of the current state of matchmaking. Now, Ghost of Hope takes the argument in kind of a new direction. He points out that he feels the big problem within Activision's report shows a large portion of the players in Call of Duty's multiplayer today are not actually fans, they are more or less flakes that are passively playing the game, in part because the game protects them. And the moment those flakes run into any type of struggle, they just simply quit because they're not really invested fans. Most of the fans that were truly invested in the game and its story and its world already started leaving Call of Duty a long time ago. Back when Call of Duty almost immediately started abandoning the aesthetic and story of the world in the multiplayer. And the fans that are left over, they don't feel a strong enough draw from the game or the world within it to want to push through any real challenge after the fact and actually get better. On the flip side of that, you have fans that try to get better, and the skill-based matchmaking does not allow them to actually see their progress, and then they get frustrated and they want to quit the game for those reasons. Even still, you look at the drop in this, quote-unquote flaky community, and even though Activision tries to make it look like a much larger margin than it actually is, its highest drop is less than 2%. And this point got called out by Mark Rubin, yet another ex-Call of Duty dev. And if you look closely, you can actually see that if you were to average out the drop across the board, it's less than even 1%, which means that if you had an even more invested fan base, the drop would be even less than that. And if you gave it more time, a lot of people who would have the ability to now actually see their progress and feel rewarded for it would probably stick with the game even longer over the course of a much more extensive study. Which, just spitballing here, but with all those factors combined over the course of, let's say, a year, the actual net difference probably wouldn't be measurable, right? And without the study being long enough or extensive enough to see the retention of the players who can now visibly see and feel the difference as they get better at the game, how do we know for sure that those players staying and getting better would not equate to a net positive of player retention by the end of the year? So, in short, the fans are asking for a simplified matchmaking system. And they would be happier knowing such a change had been implemented, and it wouldn't really be a detriment at all to the player retention. Then why not just do that for your fans? That's one of the major questions hitting the discussion right now. But we will get into that in a second. Now, what do I mean by invested and flaky fan bases? How can you quantify or identify what fan base is more invested or not, and how can you quantify why that one fan base is more or less invested? So this really all comes down to past player retention data, because that's the linchpin of this whole argument. Will reducing skill-based matchmaking or modifying it to how it was back in the day positively or negatively affect player retention? Now, some points of confusion with certain people is that these older Call of Duties had a much looser and lighter form of balancing that were more rank or time played based rather than skill-based, but their results went in the opposite direction of Activision's recent study. Those games were still able to achieve massive player retention percentages that retained pretty much massive, at the very least decent player count percentages over the course of the years, well beyond each Call of Duty's initial run. Though this data can be hard to find, if you look deep enough, you can find old official reports from Activision from those years that they would pull out and brag about at their quarterly meetings with investors. As well as when you utilize old Steam charts, for instance, the performance is clearly visible. Part of the reason for people sticking with these games years after they came out, even when other Call of Duties had come out thereafter, is because the fandom was not flaky, but rather super invested. Super invested in the game and the world it created and the aesthetic and the story and the character. These were the original features of the game that were prioritized to draw fans in and keep them invested, and it worked really well. A lot of people sticking with these games did not have good kill-to-death ratios, but that didn't matter. They were obsessed and invested in the world of the games. I remember playing Call of Duty 4, not being great at the multiplayer. I had a .87 KD, but I kept playing because I was absolutely obsessed and invested in the world and story of the game. And then I played World at War. I had a .9 KD, but I still loved it, and I still kept playing. And then Modern Warfare 2, I had like a 0.97, still not positive, still loved it, still kept going, still kept playing. Finally, Black Ops 1, I had a 1.5 KD. I'm barely positive and I'm having a blast, and eventually you get me to Black Ops 2, and I pretty much peaked around a 2.0. I finally worked my way up, I got to see what I earned, I got to see how much I had improved, and part of what made the games fun enough to keep coming back to, even when I was getting absolutely shit on, was just the world within the game itself, on top of the good multiplayer. It was all collectively worthy of our obsession and our investment into it. There was not a constant presence of ads for microtransactions bombarding our faces when we loaded up the game. Every time we would pop on, we would simply load up the game and get right into playing the game. There was no silly costumes or cosmetics slowly but surely consuming the visuals and selling out the identity of the game. Unlike now, where the game sells out its own identity until it's almost unrecognizable, so that years later when fans pop back in, they see that it is not the game that they initially fell in love with back in the day, and they quickly determine, yeah, I'm really not that interested in playing it again after all. If you're not preserving the world of the game, you are not preserving the memory of the game that brings people back to play it again. It is that simple. All of this also needs to be a part of the conversation, because the introduction of aesthetic-changing microtransactions that essentially sell out the world and aesthetic that the fans were initially introduced to when they first got their hands on the game and fell in love with it creates essentially a shit them and forget them mentality for the devs, where they use and abuse the game until it's done. It's no longer recognizable to its original self, but that's okay because we're moving on to the next one. And again, not preserving the world that you initially created and invited players to become a part of, turning it into something almost completely unrecognizable, has a negative effect on players' ability to stay invested in the world of your game. And that issue has compounding effects for the next game, whose world and story is connected to the previous game, whose world and story you abandoned. And the devs do try to keep you invested in the story throughout the seasons by forcing you to watch unskippable cutscenes each season, but nobody gives a shit about these cutscenes, and they look right past them, because as soon as you get past them and you get right into the game itself aesthetically does not match the world inside those cutscenes even in the slightest. And that's the price you pay for abandoning the aesthetic representation of the world inside your game. And that creates a continuous lack of investment over generations of your game, and that lack of investment also has its own effect on player retention. And remember, as soon as they introduce cosmetic microtransactions, Activision begins purposely covering up their live player counters and their retention data. This large gap occurs over several years of additional Call of Duty cycles before Modern Warfare 2022, when such data then becomes available again, at least on Steam. And through that, we can easily see that player retention in modern Call of Duties does not compete with older Call of Duties. Based on other data that has now come out for more recent Call of Duty introductions, we can compare that Modern Warfare 2022 player retention performed worse than even Vanguard, Cold War, or Modern Warfare 2019, seeing an over 80% drop in player retention in just under 6 months. And these numbers include Warzone, by the way, because Activision knew that Modern Warfare 2's numbers were going to continue the trends of recent Call of Duties and not perform well. And Activision did not want those numbers to be seen on their own, and made sure that they would be hidden underneath the large number of the collective tally of Warzone numbers as well. And even still, through all of that, we can see the player retention is not good because fans are simply not invested. Here we can do a comparison aligning this 8-month chart for Modern Warfare 2022 and Warzone, and compare its player retention to an older Steam chart with Golden Era Call of Duties that goes over the course of 2 years. Now, to be fair, because I know people will point out that there's a lot more people buying Call of Duty on Steam right now than players buying Call of Duty on Steam back in the day, so I will adjust the charts to only show how well each set of games is retaining the number of players that they actually have, because that is what this is all about. It's not necessarily about how many purchases were made on this particular platform, but how well each Call of Duty is able to retain a large percentage of those players and keep them invested as time goes on. Now, as you can see, over a 6-month period of time, player retention used to drop only around 40 to 50% max. You would also notice that this light green line represents the original Modern Warfare 2 from 2009. It starts showing its retention at about a year's point after its release, and its player retention is still sitting between the 65 and 75 percentile of its achieved launch numbers, meaning that it only dropped between 25 and 35% over the course of an entire year. Overall retention seeing its only sharp drop after the release of Battlefield 3, a very competitive title. Even still, the percentages of retention are much more impressive than what Call of Duty has been achieving recently. So, if anything, this chart released by Activision shows that their problems regarding player retention are much bigger than skill-based balancing alone. But it also shows that it would not be a big deal at all for them to lower the intensity of all of their balancing measures, making it as loose as possible, because even without skill-based matchmaking or balancing at all, the difference in people staying and pushing through it and those dropping off and leaving is collectively less than a 1% change. Compared to the other issues hurting player retention in the 10s, 20s, and 30s percentiles, they would not at all be hurt by reverting back to classic forms of matchmaking. So if the fans are asking for it, why aren't they giving it to them? Well, included in their engagement-optimized matchmaking system are facets that they are still trying to utilize to push more sales of microtransactions. Activision is actually being sued right now with a suit that started in 2023 for putting so much time, effort, and focus in finding ways to addict players, specifically targeting young players to become addicted to the game through microtransactions. And they even hire psychiatrists to help them figure out ways to do this more effectively, meaning that they've given up on the traditional ways of keeping people drawn into the game via just relying on making a good world or a good game, good story, good multiplayer, and preserving it, and have instead moved on to prioritizing online purchase addictions. This isn't new. This is not secret. And if Microsoft really wants to avoid trouble in the future, they need to run away from this practice as fast as possible, because if these cases start setting precedents, they are fucking screwed. But anyways, I digress. These things collectively is what the conversation should really be about, and it's pretty obvious that Activision is going to ignore that. But Activision did release this visual to explain how they aim to prioritize facets of their matchmaking from this point forward. It appears now they do prioritize ping, but we all know they've said that in the past, and it turns out that they were just being carefully wordy with how they stated it, but we'll get back to that in a second. Anyways, after ping, you then see they have the second tier, which is time to match and playlist diversity. So again, more stuff related to your connection as well as what game modes you were just playing. And then finally in tier 3, you have recent maps and skill being applied into the equation, and at the very bottom you have voice chat. Now back to ping being prioritized. They made a statement about this in the past that ping was a top priority. But it later turned out that ping was not the top priority, just one of the ones towards the top, and it was actually second to them prioritizing skill or engagement. The real priorities or mechanisms applied before ping at this time lied in things like matching low-skilled players without cosmetics with high-skilled players who have cosmetics, for instance. So it's interesting that they provided a study getting really in-depth and adamant about the negative effects on player retention from having no balancing whatsoever, but they won't do a small study on the negative impact players might feel being in a system that orchestrates interactions for players to get punished for not buying cosmetics. I don't know, but for some reason I feel like the negativity on that one is of a much greater margin. But anyways, this current system appears to show ping as the main priority, and then the lobby then balanced after the fact based on skill, which is, when you think about it, very much similar to older Call of Duties and also very much similar to X-Defiant right now. And they show no mention in this matchmaking system identifying cosmetic interactions or lack of interactions with those with cosmetics, which is possibly good news, that we are on track to a mostly bare-bones matchmaking system, or it's possible still that they are just simply omitting that part, which would be really bad. But again, not unlike what they have done in the past. But if you read their detailed description, it does appear that Activision is suggesting that they have moved back to a more classic form of matchmaking, which is prioritizing ping and then team balancing being the, quote, key factor thereafter, which, if they have taken out the engagement-optimized matchmaking related to microtransactions, and if everything else they're describing is absolutely true, this is super good news, and the only question left is then how strict or invasive is the team balancing? Because yes, you can make it too strict, you can take it too far. As X-Defiant found out very quickly and had to make adjustments to how strict their team balancing was almost immediately, because even that can be turned up way too high. There's another issue regarding player retention when it comes to players being tricked into playing longer versus players actually having fun. JGod did a great video on this. We're not going to get into it in this video because it's so extensive. I might make a video on this later, but it's basically an expansion of what we previously talked about, when instead of focusing on the world of your game, the characters of your game, the invitive nature, the immersiveness of your game and playability, and providing a good multiplayer that calls back to an amazing world you created in the campaign, rather than relying on all those things to reel people in and keep them reeled in, they then switch to prioritizing their focus on keeping people drawn in based on a purchasing addiction. Yes, you may increase those individuals' time in the game, but it doesn't mean you've actually made the game more fun for their experience. Or if you introduce challenges that aren't fun but kind of easy because you know people will sit there and technically spend more time on the game to finish this easy, boring challenge, then yeah, you have tricked them into spending more time on the game, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're having more fun. So yeah, this subject is super fascinating and relevant, and if that interests you, go check out JGod's video. It's pretty good. I think he's going to do another one as well. Anyways, what are you guys thinking about the news? Are you optimistic? Does this make you feel more at ease when it comes to the prospects of possibly buying the next Call of Duty? Or are you like me and think they should go back to a very rudimentary system of matchmaking where you match everybody into a lobby based purely on their ping and their connection, and then you do a simple rudimentary form of team balancing after the fact and call it a day? Or are you one of those people who believe even if matchmaking is fixed, microtransactions are still too invasive for you to fully enjoy the game? Let me know down in the comments. Anyways, that's the end of this video. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Comment down below, and I will catch you guys next time.